So the White House National Security Adviser is H.R. McMaster. He's a general, and he's picked by Donald Trump, well respected. Now I'm positive that when you got onto policy issues, there's a lot that I would disagree with McMaster on. And in fact, on one of the core issues that they're fighting on, which is whether to increase troops in Afghanistan, I disagree with McMaster, and I've said on the show several times, I appreciate Donald Trump's hesitancy to put more troops in. Now, as we found out, of course, part of the reason for that is they want to privatize the military and send in private mercenaries instead, which does not help the situation at all. McMaster is opposed to that, and he's very right about that. So that's all of a way of saying it's not like I've got a dog in this fight. I'm not a fan of McMaster, and I'm certainly not a fan of his policies. But he's been having difficulties with Steve Bannon, who is part of the alt-right, proudly so, and has said in the past that Breitbart, which is a publication he ran before joining the Trump team, was the home of the alt-right. And so the alt-right has unleashed on McMaster because of this power struggle. One of the original reasons for it is not based on policy. It's that Steve Bannon got the president to put him on the National Security Council, which is outrageous. He has no experience in the field. He has no business being part of that at all. Chief strategist, you want to strategize about how to get white nationalist voters to vote for Trump? That's your business. It's horrific business, but it certainly has no business in the National Security Council. So McMaster basically had him removed and has recently fired some of his acolytes for writing insane memos about how the Marxists and Maoists and Islamists are planning to work together to undermine the president. Just total Looney Tune stuff. So on that stuff, again, McMaster is right. But where it gets really dirty is the campaign against McMaster. So Axios has a update on that, and they say the bare-knuckle campaign to remove National Security Adviser H.R. McMaster from the White House is about to get much uglier. Now, it was already ugly. There was tons of articles written about him and how he's part of the globalists, and at the same time against Israel. We'll get into that in a second. But apparently they're going to take it to a new level now. And by the way, many other things said about McMaster on Breitbart and by many members of the alt-right community, such as they are. So Jonathan Swan at Axios explains the new line of attack. Outside forces opposed to McMaster are going to allege he has a drinking problem. According to sources outside the Trump administration familiar with the anti-McMaster campaign, the controversial nationalist Mike Cernovich, who has an inside track on the anti-McMaster campaign, teased the alcohol attack in an internet video with Alex Jones of the website InfoWars. Anti-McMaster forces believe this attack will harm his standing with the president, who's a teetotaler. So they made up all sorts of specifics about his drinking, so-called drinking habit. These guys are perennial liars. They lie for a living. I wouldn't believe one word of what any of them said. And I don't know, nor do I care about what McMaster drinks or doesn't drink. I bring that to you because they have no bounds. There is no bounds of reason or decency with these people. And as Priebus once told Bannon in another story that came out last week, when he went up to him back when Priebus was in the White House, he said, Steve, you know when you get these guys to say these terrible things about people, we know it's you. Everybody knows it's you. You used to run Breitbart. Like, you're not tricking anyone. We know what you're up to. And Bannon's like, what, me? Oh, little old me? Oh, did Breitbart write a story? Did all my allies in the alt-right write stories about McMaster? Oh, that's probably a coincidence. What ridiculous liars, and honestly, scumbags these guys are. They want to destroy people personally. They do it for sport, and they think that, that's how you play politics. And sometimes you got to hold a rally in Charlottesville with torches and Confederate flags and some swastikas. And sometimes you got to personally destroy someone who's your political opponent. Battle of ideas. We're the alt-right, white nationalists. Of course they can't win the battle of ideas. They've lost it entirely. So they go personal. Now, inside the White House, at least as regards to anyone but Trump, it is not working, of course. Another official told me, Jonathan Swan says, the majority of the senior staff have rallied around McMaster and believe that all of the attacks against him are divorced from reality. To which I say, of course! The alt-right does not care about facts, does not care about reality. It's funny because that's usual projection that the right wing does. They'll say we care about facts, we don't care about emotions. That's not remotely true. Almost all of these things that they charge others, their opponents with, are made up, are lies. In reality, all they care about is one emotion or two emotions: fear and hatred. Fear and hatred. Those are their emotions, and that's what they care about, and they think by any means necessary. One more update from Swan in regards to whether it's working. Chief of Staff John Kelly, another retired general, finds the attacks dishonorable and disgusting, according to a source close to Kelly. But remember, their opinions don't matter, only Trump's opinion matters. And they know that Trump is stupid, so they think, look, he cares whether people drink or not. So let's say that the guy drinks. And maybe Trump will be stupid enough to do our bidding and fire our political opponent. That's a 50-50 proposition, certainly entirely possible. So now, the other line of attack against McMaster is that he's not sufficiently supportive of Israel, and by some implication, not sufficiently supportive of Jewish Americans. Preposterous. But let me tell you where it comes from, and it is gross. Some White House officials were startled by the force of a recent statement by the conservative pro-Israel group, the Zionist Organization of America. On Wednesday, ZOA's President Mort Klein issued a report accusing McMaster of being hostile towards Israel and unserious about the threats of Iran and radical Islamic terrorism. Klein called on the president to reassign him to another position where he can do no further harm on these critical national security issues. Okay, the Zionists of America is funded by Sheldon Adelson, who is a huge Republican donor, claims he's a friend of Israel, doesn't actually care about what is in Israel's interests, according to others, as you'll see, will forcefully condemn this nonsense that's made up. What he cares about is, hey, I want to pay my workers in my casinos less. I want to have lower taxes. So I'm going to get in bed with the alt-right who hate Jews? So what? I want lower taxes. So if I got to support Trump and I got to support Steve Bannon, I got to support the alt-right who's showing up with, by the way, Nazi paraphernalia in Charlottesville, so what? I'll do their bidding for them. You must be so proud. More from Axios. Bannon has told associates he has nothing to do with the hits on McMaster, calling them a spontaneous reaction against the globalist from Trump's national base. But senior White House officials don't believe him. I want you to understand what globalist means. Globalist is a term that Steve Bannon came up with to refer to the financial elite, the bankers, and other people who are controlling things behind the scenes. If you don't still know what I'm talking about because you haven't read the history of anti-Semitism, he's referring to Jews. Now, I'm not the one saying that. It's the alt-right. It's the Daily Stormer. It's those guys who go, yes, that's it. Globalist means Jews. He's on our side. We hate the Jews. I'll have more on that in a second. Now, a former senior Israeli military official had this to say: such an attack is not mere opinion. It is an offense against the truth, against basic decency, and against the best interests of Israel as we see them. So saying the attacks against McMaster are horrible, totally not true, and an offense against Israel itself. By the way, in Charlottesville, one of the chants that they chanted in that alt-right march was, quote, "The Jews will not replace us." Now, Sam Nunberg is another person who is a Steve Bannon ally. He gets on the press now and he goes on the attack because now there is an effort to fire Steve Bannon for encouraging what happened in Charlottesville and to show people that they actually care and they will do something about this white nationalism that's not causing violence in America. But Nunberg is very upset about that, and he says, if Steve is fired by the White House and a bunch of generals take over the White House, there will be hell to pay. What, Charlottesville wasn't enough hell? So there's going to be further hell. You see what they're doing? I mean, this is not just about some horrible people at a rally, even though there were so many of them, thousands of them, and so many more online that follow hateful alt-right, white nationalists all across the internet. It's now in the government, and within the government, they're trying to fire people who are not in that camp and saying if you fire our white nationalists, there'll be hell to pay. They're threatening the core of America, and they're doing it brazenly and openly. These people are disgusting and completely un-American. By the way, again, I gave credit earlier in the show to Republicans who stood up against the domestic terrorism, against the hatred, the KKK and the neo-Nazis, etc. in Charlottesville. Another guy standing up is actually Matt Drudge, of all people. I wouldn't have pictured me being on the same side as Ted Cruz and Matt Drudge, but here they're doing the right thing. And I'm greatly surprised by Drudge, but all the credit in the world to him for standing up against hate and saying this is not the direction you should go. But Nunberg is mad about that. So he says he went on to call out Drudge for promoting hit pieces of Bannon and sharing articles that shine a favorable light on Trump's advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Not only is he showing negative articles about Bannon, but he's showing positive articles about Kushner. I don't know if you know this, but Kushner is a Jewish American. Ooh, we wouldn't have want any positive articles about him, and that drives them crazy because he's in the family, and it's harder to attack him. And so when they do, they want credit for it. So Nunberg then says, Matt should go back into his hobble hole in Miami and listen to techno. Matt should understand that people like me can blow him the fuck up. Fuck Conor McGregor, blow him the fuck up. Now, the reason he's saying Conor McGregor there is he's pronouncing fuck in the way that Conor McGregor does. McGregor has got nothing to do with any of this, okay? Just this idiot who thinks he's a tough guy trying to quote McGregor. But threats of violence right there, very clear. He goes on. He said he went on to say that McMaster, along with White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, cannot, quote, hide behind their service, and then he could also, quote, blow the fuck up McMaster. So now we've got the alt-right saying veterans, who cares about veterans? Don't hide behind your service. Are you kidding me? Look at what you guys did hiding behind the troops. Oh, support the troops, support the troops. And the minute there's actually any veterans, you're like, who cares about their service? I don't care at all. Don't hide behind their service. And then he's threatening to blow up the National Security Adviser. How long are we going to tolerate this? And again, we don't do the things that they do. We don't believe in violence. We don't believe in vigilante stuff. We don't believe in extrajudicial anything. So, but within the confines of the law, the Attorney General, who is doing good work on Charlottesville, and the authorities have to start investigating these white nationalists, not for their speech. They love to hide behind that too. Oh, freedom of speech, I just said I'd blow them up. I have a right to say that. No, you don't. You have a right to your political opinions. You even have a right to hate speech. You don't have a right to incite violence and promise acts of violence against government officials, including our National Security Advisor. And finally, one more from Nunberg. He said, whoever in John Swan's Axios piece is familiar with Trump's thinking should get fucking familiar with the president's base. Yet another threat. Remember, these are the same guys who said if there was any attempt to get people to vote against Trump in the Republican convention, that they would find out who was leading that, and they would go to their hotel room and knock in the middle of the night, and then do God knows what. You can call them white nationalists, you can call them brown shirts, but they're here and they're telling you that they mean to do harm, and I don't think they're kidding. Are we America or are we not? If we're America, we stand up against this. Young Turks. If you like this clip of the Young Turks, you know there's a whole live 2-hour show, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern every day, and you can download it or stream it and watch it without ads if you become a member. tytnetwork.com/join.